Tom Burke is here. He chairs and is the founding director of E3G, Experts on Climate and Energy Policy, and there is nothing he does not know. There is no question he cannot answer when it comes to the climate, and I know that because he told me. Welcome, Tom.
Hi, Eddie.
Are you ready for this?
I'm a bit oversold, but I'll do my best.
Okay, well, that's... I'm sure you're going to be fine. Nicholas is in Brighton. Hi, Nicholas. Tom is here. What's your question for him?
Yeah, g'day, Tom. G'day, Eddie. How are you?
Fine, how are you?
Good. Yeah, not too bad. I'm just phoning with a couple of things. First of all, a bit of good news. Are you aware of the Harvard-affiliated Canadian company that's made a liquid fuel that's carbon neutral by drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere and then merging it with hydrogen to create a fuel that when it burns, it releases no emissions, and it's also, you can put it in any vehicle that is currently on the road.
Tom, you must be aware of that.
There's an awful lot of people now looking for different ways to come up with exactly the kind of thing that Nicholas is talking about, a liquid fuel that you can make from carbon dioxide that you've taken out of the air. Now, whether that's actually technically possible to the scale we'll need it, I think we're a long way from knowing that. But what's really interesting is...
We know that now because they've proved that it is. And they said that basically, as long as we put the infrastructure in place, and we get, we're talking, we'd need tens of thousands of these plants, literally alongside, for example, electrical production plants, because obviously they do need electricity to create the operation. But it's scalable and it's there now. But it's brand new.
Well, as I say, I think there's a lot of... One of the things that climate change has done is release an enormous amount of innovation of all kinds. And innovation of just the kind Nicholas is talking about has been certainly happening. Now, there's a big difference between getting something to work in a laboratory on a small scale and getting it to be actually available commercially, economically. And what I'm saying I don't know is the second bit. I'm not doubting that you can make something like this work, as it were, experimentally. But making that translation can be quite a big effort, cost a lot of money.
And Nicholas, what was the other point you wanted to make?
Well, the other question is, I mean, let me set my stall out here because I believe it's a great thing that's going on at the moment, and we really need to stop polluting our atmosphere. I mean, Fukushima is still leaking. There's a whole lot of pretty bad stuff going on at the moment, but I worry that sometimes our focus goes in the wrong direction. So, for example, there was a chap on earlier talking to James O'Brien, I think it was Sheila Fergity, and he was mentioning about the exacerbation of storms. There's more hurricanes and there's bigger hurricanes and tropical storms and earthquakes and stuff. But there's over 100 peer-reviewed papers now that link that to solar forcing. It's the integration of the energy coming into our system being incorporated into our planet. Much the same way as when you connect the full battery to an empty battery, you end up with two half-full batteries.
So your point is we shouldn't worry so much about climate change because that's not messing with the weather?
No, because we create pockets of climate change when we cut down or burn forests, for example. We create these small pockets as mankind. That's absolutely unrefutable. But things like the storms, etc., they're mostly due, and freak storms, freak hailstorms, snowstorms, these things are all due to and coincide with events that are happening on our star.
All right, Tom, your thoughts on that?
I just disagree, I'm afraid. That's not what I understand. My understanding of the science, and I look at it fairly carefully all the time, is that you can't find a correlation between sunspot activity and changes in climate.
What about the 100 or so peer-reviewed reports that they're talking about?
I've never heard that reference made before, so I can't. I mean, it's he says, she says argument. I can't deal with that. But I can say what I've understood very carefully, and also the fact that there are many sources of evidence for what's happening to the climate. Nobody's picking up one factor and saying, that's it. People are picking up lots of different factors, adding them all up and saying, hang on, if you look at it from dozens of different directions, you still come to the same answer. It's carbon dioxide, and greenhouse gases that are causing the problem.
Nicholas, thank you for the call. And Tom, off to a running start. If you have a question for Tom or a point to make, it's 0345 6060 973. At least the day of the big climate strike around the world. We'll carry on reporting on that throughout the programme. For this hour, Tom Burke is here, climate and energy expert, already fielding questions from LBC listeners. And if you have a nagging doubt, a question, a quibble about what we as individuals can do, give us a call, 0345 6060 973. Simon in Orpington is next. Hi, Simon. What's your question for Tom?
Hello, gents. Yeah, nice to speak to you both. Being up front, I would describe myself over human-caused climate change as an uninformed sceptic. And I think part of that scepticism is because a lot of the policies seem to be around taxing people, and some of them seem quite authoritarian. So my question is, would your guest think people like myself might be more open to learning about it and actually changing their ways if it was more incentive-based rather than perceiving it as an opportunity to tax people?
Tom.
Simon, I think you're absolutely right to pick up on this question, and also implicit in your question is a doubt that the taxes would actually be other than just a disguised revenue raising. So I couldn't agree with you more about needing to probe that question. And what's more, you're also right about the fact that people respond to incentives better than they respond to constraints. And so one of the reasons why you might want to have a small tax on carbon is not because that price effect would change things, so I doubt it would very much. Much more importantly, so you could raise revenues that you could use to invest in and help accelerate the deployment of the alternatives by giving people an incentive. And in particular, the thing I think we need to give people incentives to is to improve the energy efficiency of their homes, which would get your energy bills down as well as reducing pressure on the climate. So there are lots of things that we could be doing that we're not doing in order to, as you say, incentivize people to do the thing they actually want to do most of the time because it makes sort of sense.
Simon, what sort of incentives would work for you?
Well, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, if you think of a while back, diesels were cheaper, but then we got taxed diesels because they got that wrong. And a lot of people are now paying more for the cars that they've previously got. So that seems a bit of a contradiction. And your guest, he's making some interesting comments there, but he did mention a tax and then talked about incentive. Are those two not contradicting each other?
Not necessarily. We currently have a tax on carbon that's already there. So but we also have a lot of incentives. They're not linked very well. And I think in a way the point I was trying to make was if you're going to tax, you need to link it to something that connects to the problem.
I understand that, yeah.
And what are you doing at the moment, Simon, in terms of doing your bit, so to speak? What do you do?
Well, as I say, I'm a sceptic, so I'm not doing anything.
Well, that's not a sceptic, that's a cynic, isn't it?
Well, no, I think it's a sceptic at the moment. I've just been honest, at the moment I haven't changed my ways. The example I would use is the plastic bag tax. Now I just pay more for plastic bags when I go shopping.
Have you got a house full of plastic bags and no money left?
Well, they're quite handy things, aren't they? You carry your shopping home and then you use them to take the rubbish out.
I can tell you're not a dolphin.
Well,
you know, because dolphins don't like plastic bags when they end up in the sea.
Okay, I mean, I haven't put any plastic bags in the sea.
But you'd be surprised how many of them end up there.
Do you not? Maybe then that's an issue with actually the recycling process. Would that not be?
Recycling plastic bags.
Recycling of plastic bags. Yeah, I think we've got to get a bit better about the kind of plastics we make because they're not all recyclable. So you want to be able... my experience is extraordinary in what people will do if they get the right incentives, which is why Simon's right. So that 5p tax on plastic bags actually created an 80% drop in their use. And that was an extraordinary drop that happened extremely quickly.
Simon's the only one buying them, though. Am I right, Simon?
Right, yes. Okay, but what was the benefit? What's the benefit of that 80% drop?
Oh, the benefit of that is a massive reduction, actually, in the cost of waste treatment. Plus, as Eddie was saying, life's a bit better for dolphins. You put plastic bags into the waste dumps, and actually it breaks down over time. It breaks down into small bits of plastic. And David Attenborough did a brilliant film on this not long ago, showing how that ends up going into the ocean, into fish and animals in the ocean, and then coming back to us inside some of the fish we eat.
Simon, thanks very much. Lots of interesting points. Barry's next in Reading. Hi, Barry. What do you want to say to Tom?
A couple of points. You mentioned the people think, well, why should I do anything because China is growing? I think the argument for years has been, well, we should lead the way. But my perspective is, well, we've been leading for 20 or 30 years and they're not copying us. And the other thing was, we have a policy, I think, of net zero by 2050, is that correct, in the UK? But the Extinction Rebellion demands a net zero by 2025, which is just insane. So I wonder how many of the climate protesters actually realise that, demanding net zero by 2025 means, well, no more air travel by 2025, no new cars, you shut down your existing gas power stations. It's just utterly impossible. But they demand action. When I've spoken to some activists, what actions do you want? They just shrug their shoulders.
Well,
very frustrating.
Let's hear what Tom thinks. Barry, those are interesting points. Let's start with China. If this part of the world's been leading the way for 20 years, why are they still being bad?
Well, they're not. They're like us, a different level of development, but they're doing some good things and some bad things, just as we are doing some good things and some bad things. One of the good things they've done is drop down the price of making photovoltaics so that we can use solar power much more cheaply. We buy a lot of Chinese produced solar panels, which help to lower our electricity bills and help us get to net zero. So you hear the line, and Barry's repeating something that's said all the time, but simply not true. There isn't anybody who isn't doing something. Now, none of us are doing enough, but everybody is doing something. And you can argue with each country about whether they should do more and could do more, and I think that's absolutely fair. But don't get this idea that we're the only people who are doing it. If we don't solve this problem, life gets very bad for people in China and very bad for people in India. And those governments know that too. It's not that they're not acting because we act. They're acting because they understand the impacts on themselves.
Barry, I just want to get a response before you come back to the 2025 deadline.
I agree with him. I agree with him completely.
I disagree with China. I mean, 20 years ago, we were emitting 10 tons of carbon per capita, and they were like under 2. I mean, we've actually reduced our carbon dioxide per capita to about 5. Yes, China is now ahead of ours, so surely they should have been copying us and keeping to our low level. And as I say, they're not. I was looking at Reuters the other day. China plans 226 gigawatt of new coal power projects, not just in China, but in Asia and Africa. Another article, they just built a 1,800 kilometre railway to transport 200 million tonnes of coal per year. China is planning to build over 200 new airports by 2035. I just don't think, they demand energy, and they're getting it from wherever they can. And if you look at the energy pie, that they've grown their coal consumption. They're going to continue to.
I'll let Tom in a second, Barry. I'm interested in response to Barry.
Net zero by 2025.
Barry, in response to what China's doing, should we change our behaviour in any way?
We have. We have reduced our emissions.
Yes, but should we stop doing that? Should we stop making the effort?
Demanding action from the government, we haven't done anything. That was the same week when we didn't have any coal electricity production for the first time in 100 years.
Yeah, but should we stop doing, Barry, should we stop doing what we're doing because we don't think China's doing enough?
Well, no, I think you get to a point where it's like saying, everyone should give 10%, but is that really fair on the person who's got really low emissions versus the billionaire flying 100 flights a year? No, we should, if we're doing 5 tonnes per if our emissions are 5 tonnes per capita, and France is about the same, why is China 7?
Tom?
What a Chinese person, if they were in this debate, would say is, but you're talking about what's happened in China in the last 10 years, and we started putting carbon into the atmosphere about 150 years ago, and a lot of that carbon is still there. So it's very hard to take single numbers and just say, well, this one's bigger than that one, and think that therefore is an indicator of what's fair and what's unfair. You just need to be careful about that. China is doing things it shouldn't be doing. There's no doubt at all about that. It's investing, particularly across Asia, in coal-fired power stations that are probably not going to be economic. On the other hand, it's also the biggest investor in wind and solar in the world. So it's not a simple picture about that. But I don't know if Barry heard my answer to the other question, which is I agree with him that 2025 is too soon. I don't think it's realistic to ask for that. And I think if you ask for things that are unrealistic, you kind of commit yourself to failure, really.
Tom, thank you. Barry, grateful to you as well. Tom Burke here until 5 o'clock. If you have a question, a point, it's 0345 6060 973. You can also text and tweet. We'll get to some of that in a moment or two. 4:32 now is on the day of the big climate strike. Lots going on. We'll report on the demonstrations later in the programme once again. Several businesses have joined the call for climate change and they've closed today. We'll hear from one of them, Patagonia, in just a moment. Tom Burke is with me. He chairs and is the founding director of E3G, experts on climate and energy policy. A couple of texts to go to before we go back to the phones. It's not just about tax, says Brett. People like driving 4x4 cars, taking flights and eating meat. They'll happily deny science to avoid changing their lifestyles.
I think he's right about that. I think the issue it raises is exactly why we have politicians, because he's arguing about the people's freedom to do something, drive their 4x4, fly wherever they want. But more people are concerned about their freedom from floods, their freedom from temperatures that are so hot they can't work, their freedom from all the consequences of a changing climate. So what you need politics to do is balance the freedom to and the freedom from pieces.
We've got Matt in Tooting saying, Eddie, I think we are so far behind on green and environmental issues in the UK. I run a small Airbnb property and I've spotted a definite pattern with the refuse and recycling. I can tell when I've had European guests just from the bins. UK guests generally just chuck everything in one bin liner, whereas European guests will sort, wash and bag their refuse correctly, even ringing me to ask where to put their food waste.
You'd think they'd want to throw us out rather than us take ourselves out. But that is because we were so far behind on recycling. It took us a very long time to put a serious effort into doing it. We were way behind the rest of Europe in doing it. I think we're starting to catch up. We've done a lot better in recent years in terms of recycling, in terms of getting people to do things. You can hardly go into a cafe now and not find a place where it has a different box, just as he was describing, where you put one kind of waste and you put another kind of waste. And people get into the habit of doing that, partly because they see other people doing it. And it just takes time to build that up.
Ben is next. Hello, Ben. What's your question for Tom, please?
Hi there. Just a question on electric cars, really, and the infrastructure. Not so much the charging points themselves, but we've heard a lot over the last few years about the national grid struggling to keep the lights on and all the rest of it. But if we're all being pushed towards electric cars, that electricity is going to need to come from somewhere. So how is the power grid going to cope with all that extra demand on it?
National Grid have been very clear about this. They don't see that as a problem, a fundamental problem. I mean, there are things to be resolved in the way you run the grid, the way you design the grid, the way you invest in the grid, so that you can balance the demand. But to some extent, that's going to be made easier by electric vehicles because you can use their batteries when they're not running as a way of helping you deal with peak load. So the overall situation is likely to make the grid more efficient use of the capital we spend on building it than if we didn't have electric vehicles. So and the grid have been very clear. They see a growth in electricity demand, but they don't see it as being some of the massive numbers I've seen reported in the press.
Tom, thank you. Ben, thank you. 0345 6060 973. Let's have a conversation about these companies then, which have joined the call for climate change action. They've closed today for the global climate strike. There are several of them. Ben & Jerry's, Burton, Lush, SodaStream and Patagonia. Ryan Gellert is the General Manager at Patagonia, covering Europe, the Middle East and Africa. Good afternoon to you. How are you, Ryan?
Doing very well, thank you very much.
So everyone has the day off today?
We have the day off, not here in Amsterdam, actually, because it's Climate Week. And so today there's strikes in many places, the UK included, next Friday here in the Netherlands and Italy, and actually the following Saturday, the 28th, in Switzerland. So we're closing operations, stores, and everything, depending on the location, over that schedule.
Tell me why you're doing it, because there are many companies who are sometimes rightly accused of greenwash and virtue signalling. But it seems to me if you're prepared to hit your bottom line and give your staff a paid day off, that's a little different.
Yeah, we have been in business for 46 years, and we have used the business for the vast majority of that time as kind of a vehicle for supporting environmental activism. And we believe increasingly strongly, as the evidence continues to mount, that our planet's natural systems are degrading. And in many cases, they're doing that a lot faster than scientists and other experts thought possible, even recently. And I think you just got to look at the news, and it seems like it's gone from monthly to weekly. Now it seems like it's a couple times a week, where the scientific community are offering pieces of substance, data points that really demonstrate this. I look at something in the journal Science that's come out in the last 48 hours that shows that the bird population in the U.S. and Canada has declined 29% since 1970. And to give you some context for that, I was born in the U.S. in 1972. And what that means is, in what I like to think, relatively short lifespan, we've got 3 billion less birds in the U.S. and Canada than we did when I was born. And at the same time all this is happening, we're facing one of the most significant challenges in human history, this climate and ecological crises. Our communities are becoming increasingly polarized. Our democratic systems are showing their age. And so we really feel like we have an obligation to support younger generations that are demanding that we get busy fixing the problems we've created.
Good to hear from you, and enjoy your strike day next week. That's Ryan Gellert from Patagonia, in charge of operations across Europe, the Middle East and Africa.
It's very interesting, Eddie. There's beginning to be a real sea change in the way at least some of the major corporations see their responsibility. For a very long time, they've seen it as just increasing shareholder value. But we saw a letter from Larry Fink, who's one of the the guy who runs BlackRock, one of the biggest asset managers, a couple of years ago, saying you need to take a wider view. We've seen the FT this week with a big story from Martin Wolf about how corporations need to think of a wider group of stakeholders than just their shareholders. So I think what you're seeing reflected from Mr. Gellert is exactly that shift, where people are beginning to align not just with their customers' pockets, but also with their values.
Let me bring Alexandra into the conversation. Hello, Alexandra. What do you want to say to Tom?
Hello. I've got a couple of questions. The first one is, what's the main things, in your opinion, that the government should be doing right now? What would be the most effective things in the fight against climate change, combating climate change? And the second question is specifically about the protests, and that is, what do you think would make the protests more effective? How could the protesters do a better job of making the government listen to their demands, or do you think their demands need to change?
Well, let me answer the first question first. Right now, the single most important thing the British government could do is invest about £1 billion additional in improving the energy efficiency of our dwellings and bring them all up to the EPC A or B standard. That would not only leverage an enormous amount of private money, but it would also reduce people's bills. It would improve fuel poverty situation, as well as driving down climate emissions. And it's absolutely extraordinary to imagine how you could say you want to go to net zero and not want to do that, especially as it would pay for itself. It literally pay for itself in about 5 years.
And how could the protests be made more effective?
I think the protests have been extraordinarily effective already. It's a difficult thing to sustain it, but sustaining it is a very important part of it. Quite important to remember in a way that the protests are telling you what's going on in the mass of the public, not just what's going on in the minds of the protesters. We saw the Evening Standard in London a week ago saying that 85% of people in Britain think climate change is an urgent problem, that something needs to be done about. So what you've seen is a major change in the way of the public's anxiety about the climate. So for the protesters, the organisers of the protesters, the next thing to do is to start thinking about how do you translate that wave of anxiety into things people can do in their homes, in their communities. How can you help them do things in their homes and in their communities that add up? And the problem we're always dealing with is everybody feels a little bit when they're asked to do something that they'll do it, but nobody else will. And actually what we're really seeing in a very connected world is this demonstration shows that you can now mobilize people on a massive scale through the use of that technology to do things because they can see that other people are doing them. So what you can do as the protesters is get that demonstrated down at the local level, not just at the national or international level.
Alexandra, thank you for the question. Tom, thank you for the answer, and we'll carry on this conversation between now and 5 o'clock. Oh, Tom Burke is still with us for the next few minutes. Let's make good use of him. Chris from Warsaw/Luton. He's a 2-cent person. I have 8 colour sacks to recycle in a small village in Poland. The rubbish is collected once a month and it's expensive. There's lots of fly tipping in forests. I think the correct pricing or even subsidised rubbish collection would help protect the environment. I shop very carefully there, avoiding all unnecessary packaging and plastic containers. I think the government should think about environment in every policy they introduce.
I couldn't agree more. I think you're absolutely right, Chris, and I think you should do whatever you can to project that to both in Poland and in this country to make sure that politicians hear what you're saying.
Andrew in Brighton, ask all these youngsters to give up their power-consuming mobiles.
I'm not in favour of that. One, they don't consume very much power. Two, as we're seeing, they're using that power a lot more sensibly and efficiently than most adults do.
They're organising strikes, for heaven's sake. Matt is in Hove. Hello, Matt. What's your question for Tom?
Hi, guys. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good.
And you're in Hove rather than Brighton?
Well, I'm on the edge. I
think we all are.
Hove and a bit of Hove and Brighton.
You're straddling the border. Anyway, that's not the point. What's your question?
Right, but then I've got a question and a point to make.
Oh.
My question is, why we buy all the solar panels from China when we've got a workforce in this country and we've got factories, car factories which are shutting down and steelworks which are shutting down. It could employ many people to produce solar panels, so we didn't need to get them from China. And even if they were more expensive, the jobs that would be created would kind of counteract that. That's my point on that one. The blades for wind machines apparently are made in Germany, France, and Sweden. That's another thing that we could possibly be making here. And my point of fact is that Brighton does get a lot of sunshine, and we have a wind farm about 2 or 3 miles off the coast that produces electricity for 300,000 homes, which is the population of Brighton and Hove. So we're quite self-sufficient in. I know it goes elsewhere as electricity does, but it's quite good to know that offshore wind power is driving that amount of electricity for homes. So
it is, and they're quite a sight from Brighton Beach. Let's deal with some of the points you made about getting this new technology, solar panels and wind machines made here.
He's got a very good point of that. In a sense, we missed it because we didn't put together a stable framework for investment, and because government was very vacillating about it back 10, 15 years ago, we don't have the opportunities in solar that we might have had, but we do have them in offshore wind. We have about 9,000 people work in the offshore wind industry, and that's because for the last 10 years probably, we've had a much more stable policy in offshore wind. We're now got offshore wind coming in bids in auctions just announced today, lower than the current price of electricity, so they will be subsidy free when they come in. So that's because we created a stable framework. Where we've got a really missed opportunity going on is we won't allow onshore wind to play a role, and that means we can't develop the onshore wind industry and supply chain that we should be able to do and that we've done offshore. So I agree with Matt's point. It's really important.
Matt, thank you. Claude is you're probably the last caller on this. Claude, fire away.
Okay, good afternoon. Yes, my question was about, are we really going in the right direction on the strategy of carbon reduction? When we think of ourselves as human species, that we're hugely inefficient, do you think that the cities that we live in are hugely different from the ones that were 200 years ago? Today they're made of concrete and glass. They're like huge storage heaters, just sucking in the sun's energy and then releasing it back into the environment. The buildings that we live in are terribly insulated. We cook with fossil fuels and heat our buildings with fossil fuels, and that energy just leaks out into the atmosphere. The cars we drive in are 75% inefficient. There's over 1 billion of them on the planet, and there'll soon be 1.5 billion. And all of that, most of that energy is released into the atmosphere via heat. Our factory processes and industry, heavy industry, produce huge amounts of heat. All of this heat is going into the atmosphere. and is reacting with the most abundant greenhouse gas in the atmosphere.
So what do you suggest,
a greenhouse gas that represents 35% of the entire atmosphere and has a greenhouse effect 20 times that of carbon dioxide.
So, Claude, what do you suggest?
Vapor.
What do you suggest we do?
Well, I'm saying that we're putting all our eggs in one basket by going after carbon reduction. Surely we should be talking about energy efficiency, stopping, replacing all our cars with electric cars. That would, getting rid of all the ICE cars, that would be one way.
All right. Well, Claude, as I'm sure you've been hearing, Tom is very keen on energy efficiency and has been talking about getting our homes better protected. What do you think of the central point there?
I think Claude's central point is completely correct. It's exactly the right focus. About 70% of the fossil fuels we burn, end up as waste heat, so we don't get any economic value out of that at all. Now, what we've got to do to deal with climate change is really simple. We've just got to stop burning fossil fuels. Well, Claude's point is, why are we burning fossil fuels and then throwing 70% of it away and damaging the climate as well? So the real focus is exactly as he says. One of the earliest things we can do something right away about is our buildings and making our buildings more energy efficient, and we can do that on a massive scale and create lots of jobs, by the way, for people.
Tom, thanks so much. Have you had fun?
Yeah, it's great.
Say that more convincingly.
Now, what's really nice is to hear what's on people's minds.
Yes, I've enjoyed it very much. Yeah. And you've been able to talk about some commonly expressed views.
Well, I think it's really, what's great about a program like this is you get to hear what's on people's mind, and quite a lot of the time I think we have politicians who are paying much more attention to the headlines than they are to the people.
Well, we've done our bit. Good to see you, Tom. Thanks so much. We will do this again. Tom Burke from E3G.